Welcome back to Retro Wednesday, the Titanium Hanger. This is Mike, and today I want to talk to you about vintage toy lines that scale with modern. So they were kind of ahead of their time back in the 80s. I've got about 10 or 12 different toy lines. We're going to go into it and then kind of show there are some vehicles that will work with modern toy lines, and then they look good side by side. And a lot of people say, hey, you should remake this. Well, they already did a good enough job back in the day. We'll talk about this and more coming up. First off, I want to start by saying with this video, measuring the vintage figures to the modern figures, what is the modern scale? Modern scale is 6-inch or 1/12 scale for the most part. Now, we do see Marvel Legends run a little bit taller, so I'm not going to use this as a measuring stick when I match them up to the vintage. So you've got Star Wars Black Series, which these are supposed to both be 6-foot tall people, and you've got G.I. Joe Classified running a little bit taller than that. So this will be the measuring stick to see if vintage toy lines will fit in with the modern. We'll talk about this coming up. Okay, so the first toy line I want to talk about that fits in here is A-Team. Now, I'm not going to show all the figures for all the toy lines, but some toy lines I'm going to show several figures so you can kind of see how it would integrate very well. But this is just going to show Hannibal and how he fits in with them, and it looks like he scales relatively well with them. Actually, better than I thought initially when I was going to do this, but I was actually surprised that so many of these figures match so well. And A-Team, I believe it was Gloob. I should get up on that. But yeah, look at this. What do you think? So the next toy line I want to show is in Humanoids, and so this is kind of one of those weird things where the figure with his helmet on looks like it would match, but technically what everybody's telling me from this toy line is that look at the size of the heads. They're actually G.I. Joe sized in like giant mech suits, but if you put the helmet on, it looks like it would fit. It would kind of scale, and forever, whatever you want it to be, hazmat suits are going in with, right? And Humanoids. So next up, scale-wise, would be Thundercats, and we're going to kind of rearrange this just a little bit. Scale's a little all over the place with Thundercats, and obviously you're not going to have the articulation. It's not going to match. And the modern Thundercats are a little bit bigger with a 7-inch, but for vintage, integrating into a modern display, you can put vintage figures in with your modern figures, and it would make sense. It actually makes sense that if you got some sort of animal hybrid kind of thing, they could be a little bit bigger. That's okay with me too. There's a couple of figures that would be smaller than this scale, but Thundercats is a win for scaling with modern, if you think about it. Okay, next up, the LJ and Dude line is pretty much there. Some of the characters are a little too short, some of them are right on point, like Raban back there, and then you got Paul and Sting. Fade. Yeah, so looking at them, I don't have the accessories on them. I just didn't want to lose them messing around with this. But if you can look at this, they sort of fit. They kind of look good. He's got like a military uniform on. And so this could integrate and scale well with a modern toy line. So the next few are going to be sort of cheats. And I'm going to say that because here we go with LJ and Dune. Now, if you see, Northlord is a little small, but Young Male Titan is big enough. And I actually think that couple of other ones are big enough too to go with it, but there's more or less 3 different size scales when it comes to LJN Dungeons & Dragons, and I've recently kind of noticed that, but seeing right here Young Male Titan fits in, and I think the Ogre would too, and possibly Mandu, especially with their helmets on. Okay, so this one here is a bit of a cheat, it's a bit of a stretch, but Defenders of the Earth are pretty close. They're like 5.5 inch, so maybe they're only 5-inch, so I felt like they were closer than this, especially when you get all their gear on and all that kind of stuff, but I guess they're coming up a little bit short, and they don't actually fit Defenders of the Earth. They're bigger than the average figure from back in the day, probably slightly bigger than Superpowers. So this next one's a bit of a cheat, and I kind of find it closer than other toy lines, but Black Star. Black Star actually does almost scale with these modern 6-inch figures. It was already big for the time, but the big debate and big thing is, Mike, if you're going to mention this, you have to mention He-Man, but I personally don't feel like He-Man scales with modern. As you can see, He-Man has a squatty nature going on to him. These have more straight legs, taller, and they stand up taller, almost a head taller. Makes a whole lot more sense for Black Star to fit in with modern. than the vintage He-Man, which is why all the Masterverse stuff is pretty popular, because it kind of over scales with modern. Next up, we're going to get into Bravestar and Galaxy Ranger. Now, I nowhere was I ever going to include Bravestar on this list, but the Galaxy Rangers are much closer, but they're still too big. So with that, Ramo Toys is actually going to be making a Bravestar that should scale with modern toy lines, should be the 1/12 or 6-inch scale, and with that, I guess both of these are too big, so that makes them a scale fail. Okay, so next up is the Cleco Ramo line. These are a little bit taller. They're more like the 7-inch scale. They are taller, but they still can fit in with a modern display. And especially with your Marvel figures in there, it could make a little bit more sense. So they kind of scale more like the Marvel scale. But the figures are one thing. What I think really scales well, especially with GI Joe Classified and would work, are the vehicles. See, these vehicles are quite excellent. People are just rushing out spending $300 on his tanks and that kind of stuff. Well, these are far cheaper, and they are actually scaling. It almost looks like it's made for this. Like they're made for it. I mean, we had a tricycle. You could repaint this to a tricycle. Duke fits really nice in that Defender 6x6. And then, of course, this could easily make a faux Fang. Just take one of the blades off. So, blades are hard to get, so it makes it a nice, happy second. Yes, the vehicles work really well with GI Joe Classified. That's the thing you want to do. So this leads into Sectars, and Sectars is still a little bit bigger than the average modern figure, but still pretty close. And we're about to get more from the Nacelle company, and they'll be in this same scale. But that works for me. Like if you were lining up some modern figures and you're like, hey, would these fit? I think they would fit. I think that Sectars definitely fit original. Not the Zika. Those Zikas are too small. They're 3.75 inch, but there we go. How does that look to you? Next up, I want to show you Cops and Crooks and just a couple of the figures. And so, like back here, Nightmare is pretty tall because he's got that big old weird head. Eye to eye, he's even taller than everyone. So he's big. Probably one of the tallest in line, if not the tallest. Then we have Bulletproof, which is pretty much average, normal size, but his coat gives him some bulk. And then Long Arm of the Law right there. So looking at them, size comparison, people keep saying we need new Cops and Crooks figure, but I can't see myself spending $25 to $30 per figure on these to buy modern ones when the vintage ones are already so good. And a lot of the vintage ones, aside from about a handful, like 5, a lot of you can find pretty close to complete for $20 or $30. Next up is Tonka Supernaturals, which they had a 6-inch line. A lot of people call it a 6-inch line. It's more like a 5.5, but it's really close to 6-inch. I mean, if you look right here, slightly shorter. And the thing is, with his helmet, it's molded in. This piece is not molded in, so you can pull it off, but it just looks goofy. They have trouble standing, but cool holograms. It's a day of an age gone by. We will probably never get holograms like like this again. But if they ever get remade, we've got to have holograms on these guys. Just all of these. The Visionaries and this need to have holograms, but Visionaries are nowhere near big enough to scale with modern. So I say we do need new Visionaries. I don't think there's a market for Supernaturals for them to get remade at all. I mean, there'd be a handful of people, but I don't think they'd hit 1,000 minimum order quantity like some of the smaller boutique companies need. So our Visionaries would definitely hit 1,000 though. So the last toy line that I say scales with modern really well is Spiral Zone from Tonka Spiral Zone. And with that, they do look good. They were ahead of their time with the cloth goods and all that kind of stuff. Sort of, was it Mezco that does that? But anyhow, made it for a little bit more fun factor with this toy line when you're able to actually display it with modern stuff. You're picking up some modern stuff and picking up these. There's only 9 figures, so it's harder than it sounds actually. But this line is pretty cool, especially if you like GI Joe Classified and all that kind of stuff. It's picking up these guys here, and they scale very well with modern pretty much everything. So I hope you enjoyed this look at vintage toy lines that scale with modern, and maybe you got some ideas of some stuff you might want to pick up and add to your modern display, or maybe you just can appreciate those vintage lines even more. But let me know in the comments below what you think. Like and subscribe. Happy Wednesday. Tap your hanger out.